Today on Locked On Canadiens, are we wrong about David Savard? Have we been wrong this whole time about Jonathan Drouin? And am I wrong about Josh Anderson? All of that is coming up in just one moment.
For Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 613 of Locked On Canadiens. This is one of two episodes that we will have on Wednesday. Just a programming note, we are recording this before we know what position that the Canadiens will be picking in. The draft lottery is happening after we record this, so you're getting a special bonus episode that was a live reaction to the news. My name is Laura Saba. I'm one of your hosts, also known as The Active Stick, and I'm normally joined by Scott Matlow, Habs Eyes on the Prize, but Scott is off this week, so I have a special guest joining me for one of two episodes. I'm very, very excited. Andrew Berkshire is here. Andrew, you host Game Over Montreal. You host Crosscheck NHL. You write for the Gazette. Is there anything you don't do?
Host this show, I guess, usually. I mean, talk about other teams. A lot of talk about the Montreal Canadiens this year for me after 5 years of not that much.
Right, because you were covering all kinds of analytics and things like that. So one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on was because I think as a fan base, sometimes we can get really, really caught up in narratives about certain players. And we are in our season review kind of portion of our content in the off season. And I wanted to bring up specific players because I know that you've done a lot of sort of research and analysis. You've written about it for the Montreal Gazette. And I think there are three players that I feel like a couple of them are a little bit more controversial than others. David Savard, people were talking about the signing being a bad one. Jonathan Drouin, fans seem to really love to run him out of town. And Josh Anderson, who, you know, we enjoy watching, but I think that sometimes it's important to note that he has a limited, he's limited in what he brings to the team. I love Josh Anderson. Anybody who's listened to this podcast will know he's one of my favorite players on this team. He's enjoyable to watch, but what is he really bringing to the team is the big question. So maybe let's start with David Savard. I think that was one where even early on in the season, I would be watching Game Over and I would see you say good things about him and I would be like, why am I not seeing the same thing on the ice? Like, I feel like he's a lot better than what people think he is.
In certain respects, I think that David Savard is a hole or a plug for a specific hole, we'll say. And that hole should be your sixth defenseman slot, maybe seventh defenseman slot, if you really need somebody to come in and be a shutdown defenseman. And the Canadiens instead decided to play him in top 4 minutes. And this year, frankly, he got eviscerated on the defensive side of the puck, especially. And strangely, for whatever reason, I don't know if it was putting on that Montreal Canadiens jersey or what, but he has one move in the offensive zone and nobody can stop it. It's that quick shift to the backhand and drive the net. And he was very successful with it this year. Like, very oddly, he was better offensively this year than defensively. And a big shift there happened. He started to pull those moves a lot more often under Marty St. Louis, and his defense suffered a little bit. But it's interesting to see him diversify his game a little bit as the season goes on. The thing is, he is not fit for the role he's been given. And the one thing I will say about David Savard is he did one thing decently well this year, and that was kill penalties. It was something that the Canadiens struggled with overall, but him and Romanov on the PK, very, very strong. Him and Romanov at even strength together, no, just don't do it.
It was a black hole.
It was very bad. There's not a lot of great things that we can say about David Savard overall. I think he deserves a chance to try to redeem himself from this year because early in the season, his play was actually pretty solid. It's just that he struggles containing speed off the rush. That's like his one weakness, and it was where Ducharme's Canadiens were especially awful. was allowing teams to gain speed through the neutral zone and attack off the rush, and that just really killed him. But overall, his numbers were okay, but he was killed off the rush, and none of the goalies behind him were stopping pucks while he was on the ice. Like,
Right.
absolutely brutal save percentage, like 82% or something through the first 30 or so games. It was unbelievable, unprecedented bad goaltending behind him. So that really put him out there as somebody to focus on and say, this guy sucks, he's the worst, when really he's not great, but he has specific things that he can do most of the time that we never really were able to see this season. Because I think once things go against you for a certain amount of time, if you're a guy like Savard who doesn't bring a lot in other areas of the game, you kind of just slump your shoulders, right? And then you don't have the confidence to do what you're good at either. And maybe you start having that self-doubt that you're not a real player anymore. You don't belong in this league. And it seemed like through the middle of the season, Savard had that a little bit. He just didn't have any mojo, right? And
Right.
maybe things change a little bit beginning next season, but he's one of those guys where I see him as a stopgap measure until guys like Caden Gooley, Justin Barron, and Jordan Harris are ready to be full-time players. Is that next year? I don't know. But either way, he can't play in the top four. That's like the main thing.
Right. And I think that's part of it, is that when he came on, it was a time where they lost the defenseman that usually played the most minutes, right? And somebody who was a defensive defenseman, especially in the latter half of his career. Something that surprised me a lot, actually, is you weren't the first person who said that he got a lot better offensively than defensively this year. On our episode yesterday, it was primarily focused on Caden Primo and Samuel Montembeault, but Dylan Waugh was talking about how David Savard is more impressive offensively than people thought, right? And you know, we've got friends that follow, like, let's say, the Columbus Blue Jackets that said the same thing. I was very, very surprised by that, because in my mind, like, the way that the signing was sort of talked about was he's here to eat up minutes. And in my mind, a guy that's here to eat up minutes is like a Ben Sherratt style player, but that's not what his strength is. And so before we move on real quick, like, I think that, there's a lot of questions about defense on this team still. And going forward, it's going to be a key storyline in the next couple of years as the Canadiens try to build a good team out of what they've got. What do you do with David Savard next year if you can't trade him?
I think you play him on the third pairing. You give him a partner that can move the puck, and you hope for the best, pretty much. Like, it's such a strange situation with Savard, because you look at, like, his player cards, for example, or like his past analytics, right? And going into last season, he was like, let's see here. I think he was like 95th percentile defensively the last 3 years. That's incredible. But literally the worst offensive impact in the entire league among defensemen.
Oh, wow.
So, like, what does that equate to, right? And what it equates to is in terms of raw goal difference at even strength, I believe he was third worst in the entire league over the last 3 years coming into this one.
Okay.
So part of it has to lay at the feet of Bergevin, right? Like, David Savard has a very specific skill set. Bergevin values that skill set, but what does a player bring outside of that skill set that allows them to be a complete player? And Savard never really had that. But this year was such a reverse. Like, this year, he had some of the worst defensive numbers. Like, 4th percentile in defensive numbers, from 95th the last 3 years to 4th. And then he went up to 30th percentile in offense, which, it isn't great. It's not great.
But it's better than nothing. It's better than, third worst in the league.
Yeah. So I wonder if, because David Savard was an offensive defenseman when he came into the league, right? Like, he had that Savardian spinorama was part of his repertoire. He was an offensive player in junior. And then the way that he could stick around the league was to hunker down defensively. I wonder if, as things went completely off kilter for him defensively, if he realized in order to justify his presence, he had to try to push things offensively. And in doing that, created some offense, but also it hurt his defense worse.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's very understandable. And I think, one of the things that I hope that the new Canadiens front office values is complete players, instead of trying to find a specific player that fits a specific hole, because that also went wrong with Mike Hoffman, right? Like they're like, we brought him in for power play, and that's a specific role, but he didn't bring anything else when things went awry. And so we're gonna move on to Jonathan Drouin, because we don't want to spend too much time on Mike Hoffman today. We spent a lot of time, knocking his game on this show. And in just one moment, we're gonna talk about Jonathan Drouin. Are we, as a market, wrong about Jonathan Drouin? And that's coming up in just one moment. But first, remember that rockauto.com is the only place you should be looking for all of your auto parts needs. If you go to a big chain store, this literally happened to me before Christmas. I went to a chain store. My check engine light went on, and I can't even remember what was it, an oxygen sensor is I think what it is. I don't really know all that much about cars, but I knew that's what it was. And I went to a chain store, and they quoted me a price that when I went on Rock Auto was a literal quarter of the price. So if you go to rockauto.com, they have every single car, make, model, and year. All you have to do is use the really easy to use drop-down catalog. You can even choose your own price when you order parts and accessories for your car. They've even got classic car models on there. And it's so easy to use. And best of all, you pay the same price that a professional mechanic would pay. There's no markup because you're just a regular person, not a professional. And after all of that, it gets delivered directly to your door. How easy is that? And I can tell you from experience, a quarter of the price. It's really a no-brainer. You can literally pull your phone out of your pocket right now and get all your car parts needs taken care of. Go to rockauto.com and do not forget to tell them that Locked On sent you in their How Did You Hear About Us box. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, let's talk about Jonathan Drouin. I love Jonathan Drouin. The market as a whole does not. I think part of the reason that people kind of knock Jonathan Drouin is what he was traded for and where he was picked. Yeah. I think that kind of victimizes him, because I feel like if that context did not exist, and part of it is also just being like a hometown player, right? If that context did not exist, I feel like Jonathan Drouin would be a much more loved player in this market.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Drouin, I mean, just the expectations that were put on him when he was brought here via trade, not only for what Sergachev represented for the organization, which was a Markov replacement, right? That was essentially how everyone was looking at him. So, and they still have failed to replace Markov years later. So there's that, but also he was the great French Canadian hope, right? And you had many members of the media that I won't name that talked him up as, oh, he's definitely going to be a center. He can play center, because he played center as a 19-year-old in junior when he was way too skilled to be in junior. While he was also, I believe, playing with Nikolai Ehlers, who is a significantly better player than Jonathan Drouin. But despite all that, Jonathan Drouin is making a reasonable amount of money for the player that he is. Does he have faults? 100%. There are legitimate reasons why people don't like Jonathan Drouin's play. His defensive play, even this year, where he was pretty improved, was not great. He overall, if you look at like his expected results this season, he was still one of the worst forwards on the team. However, the Canadiens have also consistently failed to get Drouin with players that fit his skill set, right? He's a player that likes to operate around the perimeter, not because he's soft, but because that's where he feels he can make those incisive passes through the middle. But they don't get anybody really with him that drives the nets, that also has like a bit of responsible defensive play with him. Like early this season, they stuck him with Josh Anderson and Christian Dvorak, neither of whom are great defensively. And like Anderson drives the net when he has the puck, but he doesn't really have the skill set of keeping his stick open in a way to accept a pass. And he doesn't really have like a one-timer, if you know what I mean. And Dvorak is a guy who can tip pucks and like be in front of the net and smack them in, but he's not really a guy that operates well off the cycle for the most part, unless his job is just at the net front or in the bumper spot. So Drouin has consistently been stuck with having to carry the puck all the time, when he should be a guy who has the puck and distributes it quickly to somebody who is more adept at breaking down offensive systems. He's a guy who's should be the secondary setup man, essentially. He's a complementary player with no line to complement. And when you have a player like that you're expecting to drive a line, it doesn't work. And that's been the issue for years now with the Montreal Canadiens.
And I think, I feel like a lot of times when we criticize players on the Montreal Canadiens, the answer, like the immediate response, and it's a very valid and legitimate response that we can have is, well, who were you going to put him with? Mm-hmm. Right? And for the longest time as well, like there are players that excel really well together, and then you put them on any other line and it doesn't work. And for me, that's a red flag, because you're catering to certain roles and you're not catering to an overall, whether you want to call it system, concept, philosophy, style of play, whatever you want to talk about. Like, if somebody fails in a specific role, can you move them somewhere else and give them success? And to me, like, I don't see a whole lot of that in the Canadiens of the past few years. And I really hope that that kind of changes. Obviously, in an ideal world, you get the best player available at every position. That's not how life works. But I feel like, and we talk about this a lot with Vegas, right? Like their whole thing is the other way. You have to be a complete player. Like your completeness matters more than your specific skill or your specific role. And you kind of end up in a situation where, like, now you're way over the cap and all you can do is interchange with more and more expensive players. Like that's essentially what you're doing. So I feel with Jonathan Drouin, like one of the reasons that he's also much maligned is that, like you said, he's not good defensively, but even when he tries, like, if he has nobody to support him in that, right? Like, you can be a player who's not that great defensively, but if the other 4 players on the ice or the other 4 skaters on the ice can kind of work within the system to help you do that, I think it's not that big a deal. But like, if you want to create offense, you also need talent. So you can't have a talented guy playing with untalented guys, or players that like don't have the same level of skill or play at the same speed as you. Like, I think the difference in speed is a huge one. I thought that offensively, when he was put with Christian Dvorak and Josh Anderson, it seemed to be the only thing clicking in like a really abysmal start to the season. Like that was the only line scoring goals. Jonathan Drouin for the first few games looked fine. He looked like, there was a resurgence. People were talking about what a great story it was. But at the same time, like, what do you do? I'm going to ask the exact same question, because fans want him traded. And I think it's really, really horrible that when, like on his Instagram, on the Canadiens Facebook, on Canadian, like people just like absolutely being like horrific about him. Like, just stop doing that. If you don't like the player, just say you don't like the player. That's it. You don't need to go into like what a failure he is, why he's the reason that he's not what's wrong with this team. No. But he said that he's committed to coming back and playing if the Canadiens will keep him. And, Kent Hughes might be like shopping him. You don't know. Like if he gets good value for Jonathan Drouin, I'm pretty sure he'll ship him off, right? What if that doesn't happen? Where do you put Jonathan Drouin on next year's Montreal Canadiens?
I think he starts the year with the Canadiens just because it's tough to move a guy who has a reputation like Drouin, who missed a bunch of last season, right? If Drouin had not been injured this season, I feel that's the biggest issue that he had this year, was that he got hurt, which is really unfortunate. His wrist that was surgically repaired already seemed to go awry on him this year. That's a big issue, if that is going to continue to follow him around. But I look at Drouin's play at the beginning of the year, and you're right. I marked 2 specific things about Drouin this year at the beginning of the year that were really impressive to me. Number 1, he was taking the puck himself and driving the net. And that's something that we've never seen from him. His go-to play entering the zone, he's great at zone entries, but he would go in and do a little button hook up to the half boards and never go deeper than that. Because it was almost like he didn't want to go into the corner and he couldn't ever find a teammate to find a pass into the middle. So that pass into the middle was not available to him for most of his career in Montreal. So this year he decided, well, I'm going to be the guy who goes in the middle. And then you have Christian Dvorak behind, who can kind of crash the net and see if there's a rebound, or Josh Anderson coming in as F3 to see if there's anything else there to like come in and support, or if there's a pass available that he can shoot home. So they had some offensive chemistry at the beginning, even though that line was literally the worst defensive line in the entire league. Their defensive numbers were atrocious, we'll say. But I marked that, and also his back checking was much more efficient. His ability to win pucks in the defensive zone much more obvious. He was winning pucks along the board and starting things going the other way. He was the guy who was carrying the bag defensively for that line. The other two guys, more passengers. Now, that's not trying to crap on them. It's just the way that it was. But Drouin, I think next year, they're going to put him in a situation where he can produce a lot of points and likely trade him at the deadline. Is just the way, because his contract is expiring, it makes sense that they get some value for him. I would like to see the way that the Canadiens are built in the future not be a situation where a guy as skilled as Drouin can't survive, right?
Right.
Because you put Jonathan Drouin on a good team, and I think he's a very good player, a very valuable player, a good complementary player. On the Montreal Canadiens, where they valued all of that like grit and jam and pugnacity, testosterone that Brian Burke always talked about, right?
Truculence.
Yes, all that. It's like when you have Ben Sherratt and David Savard and Joel Edmondson, who I think is the best of the three of them, but still limited. And, you know, Alex Romanoff, again, who doesn't have much offense to him. And you have your forward group is guys like Christian Dvorak, Brendan Gallagher, who can score, but don't create the kinds of cycle plays that a player like Drouin would fit into. It seemed like Bergevin's answer to building a very one-note team was to just acquire a guy who was very skilled and stick him in there and hope it worked, and it never worked. Like every time that he acquired a skill guy outside of Toffoli, it just didn't work, because Toffoli is that like really cerebral, smart player who attacks off the rush, which is what the Canadiens have been good at over the last several years. It's really been the only way that they can score consistently. So they need players who can contribute offensively in more than just one way. And obviously Drouin, he needs one way that he's not very successful at doing the cycle thing in Montreal. He needs a team around him that can operate in that way. And the Canadiens, as of right now, aren't that.
Right. And it's going to be a while before they get to a point where they're skilled enough to have a guy like Jonathan Drouin come in and be an answer to questions, right? And so we're going to talk about now, we're going to move on to Josh Anderson in just 1 second. I feel like Andrew's about to break my heart. Is Josh Anderson actually bad? Is the question. And that's coming up in just one moment. But first, it is summertime. Well, it's spring right now, but the weather is so warm outside. It's beautiful. You're probably going outside a lot. You're going on your hikes. You're, like if you're like me, you're going on long walks. And what do? You need energy for all of that. So check out Built Bar. It is a protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. They've got 18 delicious flavors that are all high in protein to give you that energy. They're low in sugar, and they're made with real chocolate, and they're so delicious. And not only that, they often have these special rotation flavors. Like today it was a white chocolate birthday cake. Just check out built.com. You'll find out what is the exciting, fun new flavor of the day. And like I said, they're all delicious and you get your energy from them. You might want to use them as an on-the-go breakfast sometimes, like we do before or after a workout. They're so useful, and they're not like the protein bars that you're familiar with that have a terrible texture and terrible taste. These ones are truly delicious. If you want to check them out, go to built.com. and enter LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. That's built.com. Enter LOCKED15 for 15% off your order. All right, so I feel like we talked about Jonathan Drouin, but somehow that's not going to be the most controversial segment of this episode, because, this has happened to us last season as well, even during the playoffs. Whenever we criticize Josh Anderson's play, people would get upset. People love Josh Anderson. I love Josh Anderson. It is a joy to watch him barrel at the net, not score, and crash into the boards. It's fun. He's gorgeous.
Very accurate.
He's gigantic. He's huge and fast, and he's pretty. And he sometimes does score goals though. And he's fun to watch on the ice. I think that's something that people kind of miss, with a team that's when the team's really bad, is like watching the games isn't fun. And Josh Anderson always makes it fun. Now, Josh Anderson has a limited skill set. And I think that it's time that we come to terms with it. And I feel like, Andrew, you're here to kind of, give us that reality check.
Yeah. I understand why people love Josh Anderson. The skill set, the frame, it's tantalizing, right? I think a lot of people around the NHL, if he were put up for an auction, would bid highly on Josh Anderson. They think he's going to be like Tom Wilson or the next Chris Kreider. I remember somebody on the broadcast this year say, like late in the year, saying that he could be the next Chris Kreider, just pop out a 50-goal season out of nowhere. Well, Chris Kreider is a significantly better player than Josh Anderson and a successful goalie killer at that too. But Anderson, I feel like the intelligence on the ice is not very high, like in terms of his hockey IQ, which I know a lot of people hate that terminology, but his hockey sense is not that great. And you can see it when he plays with Caulfield and Suzuki, where he's just not quite able to anticipate plays like they can. And that's understandable. Most players wouldn't be able to think the game on their level offensively. So sometimes he just kind of gets lost, and sometimes getting lost helps him because the other team's like, okay, well, we'll just worry about Caulfield and Suzuki. And then they're like, oh, look, Josh Anderson's uncovered on the other side. We're just going to pass it to him and he'll score. And that's why I think next year I'd like to see them stick with that and see if that line can bring something more out of Anderson that we've seen so far. Because overall, last year, he was improved. He was a better player defensively at the end of the year. He was very decent with Caulfield and Suzuki, especially before the trade deadline when things kind of went downhill after they got rid of Lehkonen and that line had to play hard minutes again. But if you can get a situation where, say, the Canadiens win the draft lottery tonight and Shane Wright is the only guy in the draft that is ready to play next year, and from what I've heard, he should be playing in the NHL next year, unless it's on a team like Arizona, where they just don't have the supporting cast to insulate him at all. Whereas the Canadiens could bring Shane Wright in next year and play him behind Nick Suzuki, and it'd be fine. So if you can build a third line that's a second line, that's Shane Wright, Brendan Gallagher, and Jonathan Drouin, say, to start. So Drouin brings some playmaking to that line. Shane Wright brings the cycle game and the defensive awareness. Gallagher brings defensive awareness, net front presence, bit of shooting. That sounds good. Then you can afford to bring Josh Anderson up onto that top line full time, which they couldn't really do last year just because of lack of depth. And then you've still got Christian Dvorak on the third line, starting to sound like a bit of a decent team, right? So I'd like to see them try that with Josh Anderson, but at the same he just turned 28 a couple days ago.
He's not going to change.
Yeah, well, he might get a little bit better, but the odds of him becoming a consistent offensive producer get lower and lower the further in we are. Like, this is now the age when players start to decline a little bit. Not rapidly, but it's like 28 to 30 is the end of prime years. So I don't see Josh Anderson as a core player to build around. What I did love about him this year, though, is I think he's shown a tremendous amount of leadership on this team, on a team that desperately needed it. His whole involvement in the Druin situation with mental health issues was really important, I think, for this team. He seems to be like a rock in terms of giving people confidence and being a good guy in the room. That's important. But how many times is he going to get close to 20 goals and not get it? Like, it's
well,
5
he did
times,
have
4
a
times.
little bit
now.
of injury this year. Okay.
Yes.
So,
well, I mean,
yeah.
that's the thing. The way he plays, he's going to get injured
physical.
a lot.
Yeah. I understand. There's the one more thing. Like, he really gets on Leafs fans' nerves and Sens fans' nerves. They hate watching their teams play against this guy. And it's very much a situation like you thought. Like, if the Canadiens can put together 2 good top lines, then Nick Suzuki and Cole Caulfield won't always be facing the heavy minutes, the tough matchups. So then you can kind of bring out the best in Josh Anderson. Maybe he will get to that 20 goal mark. I'm not going to, no predictions here. But I definitely, and this is all really funny because there's a chance that, tomorrow, while you're listening to this, we already know if the Canadiens won the draft lottery or not. Assuming that they can, assuming they can put together 2 competent lines, their top 6 is decent, it's competent, then Josh Anderson becomes a beneficiary of that, I think.
Yes, 100%. And having Suzuki and Caulfield grow defensively this year helps insulate him as well. Yeah. And even if you're saying, even if the Canadiens use Suzuki as their top matchup center next year, just by virtue of having a second line that can score, opposing teams will have to split up who they're matching against, right? So having that versatility will give more room to Josh Anderson, will give more room to Brendan Gallagher. I mean, Brendan Gallagher bouncing back next year, I think is pretty much a guarantee just based on his health. I think we're going to see 20-ish goals, 25 goals from Brendan Gallagher next year. I think there's a lot at the end of last season to be positive about with his game. But Josh Anderson, if he can be put in a spot where he's not expected to be a play driver, not really expected to carry the bag defensively, and is just kind of there to help the cycle and attack the front of the net, he can be a decent player. I just don't think he's a core player. And I know people love him. Just don't ever expect him to get 30 goals, right? Maybe he will one day. Crazier things have happened. Nobody would have predicted that Chris Kreider would score 50, right? It doesn't make any sense based on his history as a player. So maybe Anderson can gust up that much, but I think if you set the expectation at a healthy season, 20 to 22 goals, you'll be pleasantly surprised with Josh Anderson. But again, he's like a half point a game player, if that, for his career.
I think there's a lot of half point a game players, and the difference with Josh Anderson is that he's both big and fast, and there are so few players that are like him in the league. So it kind of, just by virtue of like the scarcity of it, people kind of assign more value to him. I'm always going to enjoy watching him play. Like if he gets traded to a team I don't like, I'm going to be very, very upset. But you know, he's fun. He's fun. And that's something that, you know, at this point, that's something that we as fans can just kind of appreciate and enjoy. And much like most of the players on this team, if we don't assign too high of an expectation on them, they're gonna be fine. So
I see him as like a more high-end Rem Pitlick, a very good bad team player.
Exactly. So Andrew, I'm going to thank you so much for joining me. We will be back tomorrow with Andrew, and we'll be reacting to the lottery results. Maybe we'll do a bit of roster building. And there'll be a Leafs game that we can react to, hopefully, positively on our end. Thank you so much, Andrew. Where can people find your work?
They can find me at youtube.com/SDPN. That's the main source for all my work right now, because I've got Game Over Montreal, which is going to be live tonight with a live reaction to the lottery. Hopefully not stepping on your guys' toes too much.
We'll be after for a reason.
Okay.
We're going live shortly after so that the people can leave your stream and then come to ours. Well,
you're always welcome to come on mine, and then we can go straight to yours. It'll be fun. We'll hop streams. And other than that, the Crosscheck NHL show on the Locked On Network. And that's pretty much all you can find me right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And if you want to find Andrew on Twitter, he's at Andrew Berkshire. If you want to find this show on Twitter, we are at LO_Canadiens. Please send us emails at lockedoncanadiens@gmail.com. You can also leave us content ideas on YouTube. If you're nice, we will take your content ideas seriously. If you are not nice, we will delete your comment and pretend you don't exist. In the meantime, my absent co-host Scott Matla can be found on Twitter at Scott Matla. And when you're done with this episode, please check out Locked On NHL, where I did a roundtable reacting to the live lottery results a little bit after they came out with a bunch of the hosts from the lottery teams. That's going to be fun. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you tomorrow.